to another edition of the Newsroom Podcast. Ryan Ray alongside the one and only Dr. Energy herself, Ellen Wald. Ellen, how's it going?
Things are very, very busy today because there is a lot of news afoot in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that we are going to talk about.
Yes.
And, it's exciting times.
It is exciting times. We have two things to get to before we get into the show. First off, RIP Giants 2019 season.
Oh, God. Thank you, refs, for all of your incredible penalties. And I may be using football season to do something more productive with my time from now on.
I say 2-3. I'm actually, you can see I got a little junk spread out here. I'm actually moving to a new studio here, hopefully next week or two. So, yeah, I'll be doing that. But the other thing, I don't know if I talked about it on this show or not. I know I told you offline, is I have joined the Bush China Foundation. And so I will be working with those guys to help promote free trade ideas between U.S. companies and China, which may or may not go against what the current administration
you are
is doing.
Fighting an uphill battle, my friend.
Yes, I know. So, anyways, we've been talking with those guys since about July about working with them, and they've got a lot of interesting things going on. And so, so I'm excited to do that and see. It's my first kind of step into this world. This is kind of where you live and reside with these think tanks and really smart people. I don't think they realize how dumb I am just quite yet, so I'll see how long I can fool them. But we'll be linking to the Bush China Foundation. We have a conference coming up. May have them on the show at some point to talk about, from their vantage point, what do they see going on with U.S.-China relations. And anyways, so just wanted to make that announcement on the show.
I have an announcement too. Tomorrow, or probably, I guess, today for listeners, since we tape one day before, September 10th, the paperback edition of Saudi Inc. is being released. And it includes a brand new chapter/epilogue that kind of brings events in the kingdom and the Aramco IPO mostly, including a discussion of the infamous Khashoggi incident up to basically this past spring.
Because the book stopped in 2015, right?
Yeah, it stopped in 2015. So it covers the death of King Abdullah, the ascension of King Salman, MBS, the Aramco IPO, and all of those happenings. So definitely check that out. I'll include a link to order this new paperback edition in the show notes. I'm supposed to get a bunch of author copies, and if I do, haven't seen them yet, but if I do, maybe we can arrange for some kind of giveaway on the podcast, because that would be really fun. Will the Audible be updated or new release? That is an excellent question. You're not the first person to ask me that, and I have to check on that. I'm not sure if they're gonna do that. Okay. Sure. Well, let us know. That's good to hear. And speaking of the Saudis, there was a little, is it kerfuffle? I use these big words now that I'm with these foundation think tanks. Fracas. I don't know. There was some news. Said, I had a good one. Someone used it. Jimmying? I don't know. I've heard all interesting. Was it better than beeping Harry Potter? That's all I want to know. It was basically like this is basically like the Harry Potter of news in Saudi Arabia. This is from the New York Times, and you are quoted because you are a celebrity like that. Saudi king appoints. Or I'm the only one who is up and answering messages at 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Hey, you know what? Either way, Saudi king appoints a son, Prince. Yeah, I'm not going to say the name. Abdulaziz as energy minister. And this has gotten, on your Twitter feed especially, a lot of questions, comments, and concerns, it seems like, around this appointment. Yeah, so this is a really interesting, this is a big change. I think I told the author, the writer of the article, this is a really momentous change to place a royal atop the oil ministry, because they've never, ever had someone from the royal family as oil minister. It's always been someone who is considered a professional, kind of not outsider, but just not a member of the royal family. Now, that being said, this guy, Prince Abdulaziz, is an oil professional. He served in the oil ministry for many years. He also was an academic. He was like a lecturer at King Fahd College of Petroleum and Minerals, which is where a lot of Saudis go to college, who then go into the oil industry. So it's not like he knows nothing. We'll talk a little later about the other big decision which happened on Labor Day, which was when the Saudis removed Khalid al-Falih, who used to be the oil minister up until a couple days ago, or Saturday night, when they removed him as chairman of the board of Aramco. They picked someone who has no idea what's going on in the oil industry. So I see this a little bit differently. He's definitely well known. He's been to lots of OPEC meetings. In fact, here, I'll tell you a little story. I was at an OPEC meeting once, and a rather prominent oil analyst from a pretty big, but not the biggest bank, kind of nudged me and said, is that the prince? And he had come into the room and was sitting in the front row. And, so when I say he's well known, maybe not quite as recognizable as Khalid al-Falih, but, people knew he was around. And
so does this officially put it into the bromance?
So that is the big question. That's actually the question. So I had some reporters ask, saying, like, what question would you ask him? Because he had his first public appearance earlier this morning. And so we were like, well, if you could ask him, what would you ask him? And then was really the top question on my mind is what's to become of the bromance? But I said something a little more appropriate. But yeah, this is a huge issue. I mean, people apparently unofficially, people will say different things like to reporters that they print in the news than they will say amongst themselves, as I have realized. Shocker. Yeah, I do that myself. So that's why you should always listen to this podcast, because I can't stop myself from telling you what I really think. Apparently the word is that, this is a big deal that Russia now, the analysts think Russia is now totally in control of OPEC. To be clear, like, Russia was really calling the shots before, but the idea is like that this Falih was a very strong personality, and he kept a good kind of, I don't want to say leash, but maybe kind of leash on Novak, at least that they had this connection, and that this guy Abdulaziz doesn't have that, and definitely comes across as a weaker personality in that respect, and that will give Novak a lot more clout. And I don't disagree with that. So that's what they're saying amongst themselves.
So just from the U.S. side of things, what inferences or implications should we consider? Because there was reports over the weekend or late last week, I can't remember, about President Trump meeting with, I believe, the Taliban and other members at Camp David. Those talks, I think they ended up getting canceled before they got started. But just out of curiosity, when you're the Middle Eastern expert here, you kind of see the U.S. is looking at potentially doing these things, pulling out troops. The Saudis are kind of doing their things. You got the Russian oligarchy that's running things now. From just a U.S. energy policy standpoint, is there anything that we should be looking at going, okay, we might see this messaging coming from the U.S. side of things?
I mean, I think at this point, the U.S. really needs to get a handle on this, because it seems like things are kind of starting to run amok. It definitely seemed, I would say like 6 months ago or a year ago, it seemed like kind of Trump was really calling the shots in many respects. Like, he would tweet and they would jump. I mean, that's what we saw last, August. He was like, oil prices are too high. Do something, OPEC. Right. And you saw basically like they were like, okay, so how high should we jump? Right. And now, oil prices are still low. There's talk now that he's got to bring them up. I personally don't see what he can do, because, everything is being ruled by all this speculation. And, what is he going to do? Cut 300 million or 3 million barrels a day from Saudi Arabia? No, there's not much that can be done. But, one of the interesting things that that Prince Abdulaziz said in his remarks on Monday morning was that Saudi Arabia plans to enrich uranium for nuclear power plants. I mean, this is a big deal. Like, the U.S. needs, from a policy standpoint, from a national security standpoint, I'd say, Trump, Pompeo, Rick Perry, they need to get on top of this. I mean, there's as far as I can tell, there's been no statement, a public statement about this from the U.S. I mean, this is like, if you look at it in connection with all these other things, these pulling troops out, maybe talking to the Taliban, maybe not, what's going on with Iran, like, they need to get a handle on this, say something, come and make a statement about what's going on in the Middle East or how they plan to deal with this.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where those Taliban talks go and where, the Saudis are making changes now. And then obviously it feels like the Iranian stuff was at a fever pitch there for a while, but that's kind of settled back down. So with all that being said, the oil prices really haven't reacted, as we talked about multiple times on the show, which leads me to this. We're a year away basically before the election on the U.S. side of things is really going to be monitored closely. Some of the Democratic talking points have been, hey, we're going to ban fracking. I think they will back off of that, obviously, as they go to a general election. But I'm just curious, Ellen.
I don't know. I'd be surprised. I mean, it's like all the rules are out the window now. So I would say that's not a sure deal.
Yeah, okay. So let's just presume that Warren, who's I think kind of take the hardest line stance against fracking, a year from now, if it's a neck and neck race between Trump and Warren, and would be about 2 months out.
Excuse me, can I just laugh about that?
I think it's funny too. But let's just hypothetically say, would that be the one thing? Because if you actually ban fracking, that would cause a huge change in price overnight. That would be the thing. I think that you see prices start to skyrocket. As we're seeing these markets shift from a geopolitical standpoint, a year from now, could the U.S. presidential election be the one geopolitical event that actually begins to move the prices? As ironic as that would be.
Oh yeah, I would say there are two things that there are only two things I could see Saudi Arabia actually doing that could raise oil prices. One is mediate between China and the U.S. on trade talks. Not going to happen. Or two, hack the election and get a Democrat elected, because that would raise oil. Given what they're all saying, that would. I mean, are we sure that Russia, the Saudis, and the Venezuelans aren't like pooling their pennies to, hire some like random Bulgarians in their basement to put Facebook ads out in favor of Elizabeth Warren? Because I mean that would definitely help their cause. Because if there was an executive order banning all fracking, forgetting the legality and constitutionality of that, even just the idea that that this is a policy that they want to pursue, I mean that would raise oil prices significantly. Imagine if you took 3 million, because apparently it was supposed to be up to 13 million barrels a day off by 2020. So say you take, probably wouldn't be all that, because they probably couldn't stop all the offshore drilling. I mean, you can't ban offshore drilling. Offshore drilling, it's not the same as fracking. So if you ban fracking,
she said she's going to revoke the leases. So I don't know.
Yeah. So that might ban. So basically, put the U.S. oil production and natural gas production also at a standstill. Meaning, both oil prices and natural gas prices would skyrocket.
Which would hurt the average consumer, but whatever.
Would basically turn out the lights in all of America because, what are we going to do? Burn coal?
Well, you would ironically, you'd be at the hands of the Soviets for your foreign policy movie.
Yeah, I mean, are we sure that the Russians aren't funding this campaign? Someone might want to look into this. I'm just saying, if there are any CNN, Washington Post reporters out there who are looking for a new Russian conspiracy,
there it is.
Maybe you want to check this out.
That would be funny if all the things that's happened and none of it's moved the oil and gas prices. The presidential election, being a close race could move the markets. But anyways,
I'd say that if you want to put money into something, I'd say that's probably the best way to try to get oil prices up in the short-ish term.
And we talk about how much the oil and gas market has changed over the last 10 years. That would be a radical shift, is that U.S. presidential policy would be the one thing that would shape the oil markets. It would be laughable at best. Okay, let's talk. Speaking of stories that have been talked about for a while, and I'm not too sure about this, but I'm curious your thoughts. Tesla battery research unveils new cell that could last 1 million with an M miles in robot taxis. We've talked a lot about EVs, and the thing has been the battery technology is not there, and there was really been no build up to this. There's been a lot of, hey, it's coming, but there's no progressive steps to make you think this is going to happen. Is this Elon Musk pumping us full of hot air, or is this the real deal?
So you should all click on this article in the show notes because they have the most amazing graphic. It's like whoever did this is a genius. It's got it's someone's hand and they're holding a like plain old AA battery and it says Tesla on the battery. And like, oh my God, it is such a great image because it makes you think like, yes, this is Tesla's product. This is going to power a million miles things in this little
one AA required.
Maybe it's this graphic was genius. Whoever thought of that, hats off to you. So then you read the article and it turns out this is a paper, a scientific research paper released by a partner that Tesla has in battery research that says that this is a theoretical battery cell that could last over 1 million miles. Mm-hmm. And so, but of course, Tesla's CEO, Elon Musk, admitted that the battery packs are not built to last for 1 million miles. Though earlier this year, Elon Musk said they built the Model 3 to last as long as a commercial truck, and that but the battery model should last between 300 and 500,000 miles, which is probably more than most people plan on driving their cars. However, so now he claims that they have a new battery coming up next year that would last 1 million miles. And this lab has released test results that seem impressive. This new battery tested is a lithium ion battery cell with a single crystal. It says NMC cathode. Is that a nickel something cathode? I don't know. They've lost me in terms of battery stuff. I'm going to call up my father who studied, electrical engineering in college, God knows how many years ago, and he'll probably be able to tell me. With a new advanced electrolyte. I know that electrolytes are something that we drink in Gatorade.
Or Pedialyte when your child's sick.
Yeah. They said they've done some extensive testing, and based on the results, they think the battery could power an electric car for over 1.6 million kilometers, which is 1 million miles. And then there's some long thing about describing the results that I'm not going to talk about because it's beyond my scientific capacity. So, but it's kind of interesting because they do say that they've tested these cells under different conditions, and that even at very high temperatures, 40 degrees Celsius, which is not that extreme. Like you want to drive your car in Saudi Arabia, like 40 degrees Celsius is like average. Right. I mean, not really, but like they get up to like 116 degrees. And then it has an active cooling system like Tesla's battery pack has. It was pushing the battery cells to over 6,000 cycles, which they think could mean 1 million miles. So maybe possibly in research, which is exciting because like, it'd be great if they can get the technology there, but let's not kid ourselves that this is not imminent, and it doesn't seem like this technology is coming to market next year.
Yeah, and the thing with these tests, I think that you should always keep in mind is that until you put it out into the wild, out into the market, the designers or the testers of these batteries, they are probably trying to push the limits. And there's one thing to try to push the limits, but there's also how regular people use things that you just can't account for. Charging cell phones or running the DVD player in the back or gassing it to get on the interstate. And you start taking in the masses driving cars, and you get a lot better representation of where the car actually will, how long the battery will go. I will say, if they do have one that can last 500,000 miles, let's say it's cut in half, then some of the things we've been concerned about with, the second or third generation use of these cars when you're selling them on the used market would be substantially, the risk there goes down dramatically. But I think you're still a long ways. You got to see people with the wear and tear, and I don't think I can't imagine that they've done enough. And I'll kind of relate this to the trucking industry. When you look at Ford, it used to have the 7.3 diesel. A lot of people consider that to be the best diesel there was. And then they went to the 6.0 diesel, and that was a train wreck. And since then, they've kind of had iterations of the diesels that have been somewhat better. And you can kind of debate on which one you like best. The 6.7 is what I have now. I say all that to say that Ford Trucking Company, or Ford Motor Company, has, I don't know how much data on the use of their vehicles, but there's got to be exponentially more than Tesla has for the use of the batteries. And so you sit there and you go, okay, is it really? So you could sit there and say, well, maybe it's just really hard to make one of these diesel engines that work like the 7.3 did, or you could be conspiratorial and say, like some people are, they don't make them as good because they want the repair money. It doesn't really matter. It's just the fact is that it's a hard thing to produce for the masses on the scale that you want it to be until you have all that data to analyze and to figure out, why are some depleting faster than others, or in the diesel case, why are some of the engines not lasting as long? So I mean, if it works, great for them. I'm not, but I don't think they have enough data to actually implement this on scale.
Yeah, and lab conditions, like you said, are totally different from conditions in reality, and do not expect it to look like AA.
Now, if it's a AA, then they have really done something with themselves. That would be really impressive.
Then we will eat our hats.
Well, yeah, and tell you what, I'll never buy flashlight batteries again. The battery business will be over as we know it, because 1,000,000 miles driving a car, a flashlight will last, like 40 lifetimes. Okay, we have a piece.
I will put those in my mouse, and then I'll never have to change the batteries.
Oh, thank goodness. That would be wonderful, wouldn't it? Okay, we have a piece here from an expert who writes for Bloomberg. Eleanor Walt, the listeners might be familiar with her work. We talk to her from time to time. What should be next for Saudi Aramco? Subtitle: With oil giant moving forward with plans for an IPO, it needs professionals with experience in the industry more than ever. Ellen, are you asking me to apply as an advisor to the Aramco board? I am available for hire. It's a small $10 million sign-on fee, but yes, I will take the position.
I don't know if you might want to not join that sinking ship, but so funny thing. So this op-ed did not originally have that title. It was changed for reasons that I cannot share. However, the URL was not changed, and the URL gives us the original title, which was Saudi Aramco's new chairman, Al Rumayyan, isn't the right man for the job.
Shots fired.
Yeah, apparently that was shots fired. So, yeah, Mr. Rumayyan, if you're listening to this podcast, I would love to meet you in person, and I will be the first one to retract and write a new piece all about just how qualified you are, if you can convince me of this, or if you'd like to dial into the podcast and tell us all about your amazing plans for Aramco, please do. We will be happy to have you as our guest.
The invitation is open, and my $10 million offer still stands. This guy aside, whether he's qualified or not, and we're going to let you weigh that in a second, the Aramco IPO just seems to be a continual series of missteps. And so the subtitle here is they need professionals with experience in the industry more than ever. They need people to tell them how the hell to think about the American investors and the other investors outside of it, because it's just like every time you turn around, it's like, guys, do you really want the IPO or not? It's really hard to figure out what's going through their head. And a lot of them, if not all of them, are educated in the States. They've been over here. We talked about them going to the Texas A&M Clemson game with Rick Perry last year. It's not like they don't have, they have the ability to get on WhatsApp or the Skype or the Zoom or whatever, make the phone call, say, hey, do you think this is a bad idea? And then someone go, yeah, that's terrible. Let's get the good ideas let's get the bad ideas out the way. Go ahead, throw them at me, and then get a good idea. But are they too hard-headed? Is it they just don't want to listen? They're not asking for advice? What's going on, Ellen?
Remember they used to talk about the echo chamber? I think that was in reference to like Iran policy in the Obama administration. And I think that they may be experiencing somewhat of that at the very top. And that there's kind of like this is a good idea, is, let's talk about this. Is this a good idea? And they're like, yes, yes, yes. And no one's kind of pushing back and saying, hold on, let's see what this might mean to somebody to the typical investor that we're looking to attract. Because that's really my issue here is that, okay, so what is it? So say you want to go on, you want to do an IPO and you're making changes at the top right beforehand. What does an investor think about that? Well, if your company's not doing well, then a change at the top would be a good idea. But
right.
Say you've got financials that show massive profits beyond any company ever in the world. No company makes this much in profit. You're basically saying, hey, buy into my IPO because we're a really great company and we're going to do even better. And yet you're switching like major top people right beforehand. That doesn't send a sign to investors of confidence, because they wanted it.
Go ahead.
I
was going to say, it actually sends the opposite to me. It's like, wait, are these profits legit? Are we cooking the books? Is everything as good as we thought it was? Because to what you're saying is you're making these huge profits. Why the change? If it's a retirement, guy gets cancer or something terrible, sure. But if you're doing so well, if I'm an investor, I'm going, well, hold on, are we actually getting the right information here?
Yeah. And also, why are you picking someone who has no experience in the oil industry? And I said, like, look at the top companies. Okay. Look at ExxonMobil and Chevron and Royal Dutch Shell and BP. All of these people, their chairman of the board are either the current CEO or people who have experience, like the guy who used to run Statoil, for example. So I can understand wanting to remove Falih, who was the oil minister, as chairman. That's a decision that actually makes sense to me, because you want to put some distance between the oil ministry, which participates in an international oil cartel, and your company, which you might want to list in a exchange that has in a country that has antitrust laws. So I can understand wanting to put some distance between there, but why not pick the CEO of the company, Ahmed Nasser, as chairman? That's something that's been done before. That's an easy choice. Why not pick who I thought if you want to pick someone close to the royal family, pick the Prince Abdulaziz, who until yesterday or 2 days ago wasn't the oil minister. Pick him. He has a sense of the oil industry. He knows what's going on. Pick him. Or pick a former Aramco executive who's hanging out in Dhahran, who was a former VP and retired at age 60 and wants to get back in the game. Look, there were so many other choices that were not the head of the Saudi public investment fund that's going to look to profit off of this. And the guy also sits on the boards of Uber and SoftBank, and there's a lot of fishy stuff going on. I just don't think that he was a choice that inspires confidence.
I'll just guess here that there are plenty of retired U.S. CEOs of major oil and gas companies that would be chomping at the bits to get a seat on the board to help strengthen your U.S. relations. And not just U.S., there's other multinational corporations that you could go to and say, okay, well, let's put someone from Europe who has a big, strong background in oil and gas. There are people you could make very strategic things to reassure investors that, hey, this is it, because those guys have a lot of pride, and you at least feel as an investor, whether it's true or not, that if they're going to put their reputation to be on the board of the Aramco IPO, during the Aramco IPO at least, that there's some integrity going on, and the messaging would get a little bit better, because the board, these guys, like just Rex Tillerson would never happen, but just someone like a Rex Tillerson, he would understand how to message it, how to deal with the politicians, how to deal with the investors. And Tillerson can also tell you, hey, guys, if you don't get on the conference call every quarter, they're going to devalue your stock just for that. So
yeah, exactly. Don't have your like head of whoever it was on the earnings call. You got to get your CEO and your chairman and you guys need to be on the call. Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is like simple stuff. Like, I mean, and I understand that this is a consequence of the company is not making these decisions. I do not think that I think the company knows this stuff. I think it's the people at the top who are making these decisions who don't have this kind of awareness. And that's really sad for me, because as someone who spent so much time researching this company that I think is actually a really excellent and incredibly impressive company that makes a crap load of money and profit and does so much with it, and to see having these bad decisions made for them, I mean, like, I'm not giving investment advice here or anything, but it's sad. I feel sad for them.
Let me ask this one thing, because I don't understand how this would work out practically. We've touched on it with Tesla when they talked about going off the stock market. Let's say that they go through the IPO. I think it's like 6 months before the stockholders who were in the IPO can sell their stock. So theoretically, if Aramco goes to the IPO process, they get exposed to all this, would it be 6 months or a year before they could get delisted or buy the stock back or whatever, or is it, or what's it? Because I can see this going to a spot where they get out there and like, oh my gosh, we didn't realize the actual headache this is going to be for us. So how long of a commitment are they tied up to? Do you know that answer? And you might not.
I don't. It's a little different, I think, in this situation, because it's not like like in a normal IPO, there's this time period after they list, after which the executives can start selling their shares. But here, no shares have been gifted to anyone. Like the monarchy, the government, or whatever, it may be at some point the PIF, but as of now it's the king, I guess, or the government owns all of Aramco shares.
Okay.
So the charter and the bylaws that they put out say that they can give gifts of shares to employees.
Mm-hmm.
And, if they did, then board members could have them and executives could have them, but there would be a waiting period before those people could cash out. But they don't own shares currently right now. All the shares are with the government. And right now they're talking about doing an initial listing on the Saudi exchange and then doing a listing on an international exchange, which has its own problems. And we can probably devote an entire show to talking about that.
Right. Okay, one final story. We're supposed to have a guest join us, so he might hop on here. Let's see. From Rig Zone via Bloomberg, actually, Venezuela oil woes deepen. It's one of those stories that it feels like you keep saying it's going to get worse before it gets better, but you get tired of saying that, but it's going to get worse before it gets better.
I thought it was interesting because it's about a Chinese contractor. A Chinese oil contractor halted work on an expansion project in Venezuela because it hadn't been paid. Hadn't been paid. This is a problem. Maybe if China is pulling out, so we have Russia not being paid or being paid in oil, and now we've got China not being paid. I mean, how long are these? Like at what point is China going to say there's nothing here for me?
I know, and these are the two biggest backers is Russia and China. So they lose any international strength if they can't get the Chinese and the Russians to stay at work with them. It's historically speaking, what would be maybe a country that you would say has been not because of war, just economic, just falling apart at the seams like this that you could look to and say, they have a lot of resources and. It almost feels like one of the African nations who has a lot of resources and just can't get it together because there's valuable assets in Venezuela to be sold to the international market, which should make them where they're profitable is not the right term, but you know what I'm saying, where they're not just having food lines everywhere.
Yeah, it's so, I don't know. I'm not even sure that there is an example. It's like a failing state, but it's like watching it fail in slow motion. Sometimes you'll see things, they fail and they just suddenly fall apart. And it's just like this, it keeps failing and failing and failing. I remember I was watching something where they were talking about should we be eating bugs? Because, it's better for the environment. It's shouldn't be eating meat. We should be eating bugs. And I was like, why are we discussing this? People in Venezuela are this is a reality for them because they can't get other food. And it's, these are signs I see. If Russia is getting out of this and if China is not going to get paid, is China really going to keep at it? Just if they're not getting paid and then they're not getting paid anything, even in kind payments, are they really gonna keep doing? They're talking about this project is a project in the Orinoco region. It's a JV, so maybe they could get someone else to come and fill in there. But who else is gonna come? Once you've pissed off the Chinese, right? You get the Iranians to come in.
Well, you remember the movie Spies Like Us?
No,
you never saw
it sounds like a movie I should see.
It was Dan Aykroyd, and Chevy Chase, and it's I guess it's in the 80s, and they go over there. Anyways, there's a scene at the end of the movie where they're playing Risk or something for countries and missile locations. It just kind of feels like Venezuela's going to get swept into some kind of negotiation where there's some kind of trade talk somewhere, and oh yeah, you get to have Venezuela and its assets, and because they have no value to bring to anything else at this point. It's really a sad scenario and a crisis that's almost doesn't seem to have a way out of it.
Yeah, at some point they have to fail or what? What's their, I can see the oil production is what I should have checked. Let's see what the latest stats are on their oil production. Okay, let's see here. We've got Platts. Let's bring this up. Platts puts their August oil production at 700,000 barrels per day. And that's down about 3,000 barrels per day. So Venezuela is producing under 1 million barrels a day. I mean, what happens when they get to like near zero? Then they can't pay their bills. I mean, they can't pay their in-kind bills to Russia. They can't. I mean, what are they going to do? Just say, here, Russia, come occupy our oil assets?
It's interesting that 700,000 barrels a day comes up, because did you hear about Mark Papa saying that he believes that this was earlier this month, actually, so it's been a few weeks back, that U.S. oil output will grow by 700,000 barrels a day. I thought it was declined by. Okay, I got that right now. I got to give that. Will only grow by 700,000 barrels a day, which is slower than estimates. So if that's right, then I need to correct that on Texas Oil and Gas Podcast. I had that backwards. I thought I read it originally as declined by, grow by, which I thought was pretty stunning. But anyways, regardless, we'll only grow by 700,000 barrels a day. It's every time you slip back, and this goes back to the conversation around, what happened when the oil prices tanked in 2014. Part of what the OPEC producers wanted to do, it felt like, was maintain their position and not lose it to shale producers. Venezuela, as they drop barrels on the market and the price is soft right now, it's not just $100 a barrel. There's not exactly a great entry point for them to come back, because if they do double their production, then the prices will fall and they won't be able to make, as much money as they could if the prices were 80 or 100, obviously. So it's a double-edged sword. They're losing production, and to increase production right now would seem to really actually hurt the prices for them.
Exactly. And it, even worse is that as far as I will admit that my understanding of the IMO 2020 thing is not up to top, but we did have someone come on the podcast to talk about it before. Maybe we should bring it back and get an update about where we are with IMO. Mm-hmm. But my understanding was that in some respects, the type of oil that Venezuela produces is going to become less valuable once low sulfur fuel for ships needs to be produced. Mm-hmm. So that's another problem.
Yeah, well, and I remember correctly, what he said was the U.S. light crude was more beneficial for that. So again, you're losing more market share as the time goes on. So, all right, and up next we have on Dr. Paul Sullivan, who is a national security and Middle East expert at the National Defense University. Dr. Sullivan, it's been quite some time since I've had you on. You were a frequent guest on the Global Energy Leaders podcast. It's good to have you on Energy Week. How are you doing, sir?
Right, doing was getting crazy by the day.
Right. Well, let's kind of get into it here. A lot of news. We were just talking before you came on about Saudi Aramco, the Taliban, kind of a lot of news, Middle East. Where do you want to start at today?
Oh, we could start. Why don't you start off? Because there is something happening. It's really kind of spinning. The Aramco business is probably going to be a lot slower than anyone expects it. The Taliban meeting with the president and not meeting with the president, lost that. Why don't we start with the Taliban?
Yeah, so just one of the things I was talking to Ellen about was when we look at what's going on now, there's been changes from Saudi Arabia on with their oil minister and Aramco. President Trump's meeting with the Taliban, then cancels the meeting. Give us, and you obviously have the Russian influence down there, from what's your standpoint on how the U.S. consumers, U.S. policy, how should we view what's going on in the Middle East with all these moving parts right now?
Well, I think a good education in the Middle East as it is would be a start to that. A good section of the Middle East is actually enveloped in chaos and violence like never before. Taking a look at Syria and Libya, for example, Sudan, South Sudan, Yemen. And you have to differentiate those countries that are enveloped in this violence and chaos with those that are run reasonably well, and actually even better than that, like the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the UAE, Egypt to some extent, and to a lesser extent, but still within that category, Morocco. When I think of the Middle East, I start in Morocco and I go all the way to the border of Pakistan and even part into Central Asia. How you define it depends on, really defines what you're going to be talking about. For consumers in this country, probably the most important areas are going to be the Straits of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the Saudi oil fields, the Iranian fields, Iranian exports or non-exports, shadow exports. There's just so much going on. Clearly, the oil market's a part of this, but a lot of trade goes through the Middle East as well, certainly through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And with regard to the Taliban, I think trying to make a meeting with the Taliban near September 11th, I felt physically nauseous when I heard about that. I was in D.C. when those attacks occurred, even though it was not the Taliban doing it. These folks had one of their bases in Afghanistan ruled by the Taliban. The Taliban are not a nation state. They're not going to negotiate like a nation state. They're guerrilla warriors. They're not going to be signing a document stating that they're going to have peace with the United States forever. They're going to sign a document and then wait until we're out. They'll come down from the mountains from their permanent cookouts up there and essentially take over and start abusing the people of Afghanistan and bringing in their ideology, which, by the way, is so far from Islam that it's disgusting. And most Muslims would believe that. Can the Taliban affect markets? Yes, they can if they go on the attack or they support others in their attack. Right now, they're kind of on their back heels, but they're starting to get more violent in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not a big source of oil, at least not a big source of minerals just yet, although there are about $4 trillion worth of minerals in Afghanistan in the ground that haven't been gotten out there. Natural gas, there's some in the north, and of course that's an interesting story, going to Unocal just before 9/11, and the Taliban being in Houston and actually being in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks before 9/11. Lots of interesting stories there.
Yeah, so it's really interesting what you mentioned, as Afghanistan is not a really big market player right now, and yet the Taliban have this ability or potential ability to send shockwaves across the Middle East in ways that could affect other markets. What do you see them? Obviously, they're not next to Iraq, but we're seeing similar instability in Iraq. Do you see Iraq suffering from maybe a similar type of instability, given all of the players that are in play in Iraq? And Iraq obviously is an important oil producer and oil exporter. Maybe you could give us your sense of what's in store there.
Well, could Iraq be another Afghanistan, I think is what you're asking me. And right now that would be unlikely in the core of Iraq, but there are sections of Iraq that were pretty close to being like the worst of Afghanistan for a while in the early 2000s. Is there a possibility that Iraq could split into 2 or 3 states? Absolutely, yes. I often wonder what's keeping it together. The Kurds essentially consider themselves an independent country. They have an oath of allegiance to Kurdistan when their military is signed in, not to Iraq. The south is pretty much run by the Shia and Iran. And the west is nominally Sunni run, but mostly empty space. That's where most of the natural gas is. Most of the oil in Iraq, as you know, Ellen, is in the south, in the Shia-controlled areas. And about 50 to 20% is the north, depending on how you're measuring it. Most of the ways of getting the oil out of Iraq, well, there aren't that many. There are 2 major ports in the south and very few pipelines. And then there are a couple of pipelines in the north. The economy of Iraq is very much dependent on oil, and Iraq's oil production is going through the roof. They're doing very well, and actually they're knocking the markets back and forth by overproducing. The minister involved with oil production in Iraq today said they will start cutting back in the fall and the winter. And, well, I'll believe it when I see it. But the potential for Iraq to go into greater violence is quite high. Not a Yemeni violence or a 1994 through 2000 Taliban sort of violence, but the ethnicities and the separate communities, the long-standing feuds, And also, the economy is not coming back in the South as many had hoped. It is in the North. It's almost like they call it a different Iraq in the North, because it's much better developed. They have the newer natural gas electricity generating stations. The roads are better, so forth.
Yeah. One question. I'm glad Ellen brought up Iraq. We've talked about this. There's kind of been a debate online and Twitter. You've probably seen this as well. Is how much is Iranian oil going through Iraq? What's your sentiment on that? Is that something that the Iranians are actually moving a lot of oil through Iraq? I know Ellen seems to be, last I remember, kind of skeptical about that. What's your take on that?
How would they do it? That's the question. There aren't that many significant pipelines. They would have, well, the way this was done way back when, which really wasn't that way back when the Iraqis were smuggling oil over the mountains into Turkey, they would have donkeys with things on their backs. There isn't the capacity to move a lot of Iranian oil except through barges or overland and trucks and all that. And really that would be observable. The shadow Iranian oil exports are really going through what used to be known as daisy chains. There would be a ship leaving port, and then it would offload onto another ship that had nothing to do with Iran, which would offload onto another ship, and it would make it more difficult, at least back then, to trace. But now we have different ways of tracing these things. You can shut off the transponder, and there are satellites up there that can see these things moving. The Iranians are exporting not non-zero oil. They are getting oil out. The Chinese are buying a lot of Iranian oil. The Chinese just made a huge deal with Iran for the development of infrastructure and to develop oil fields. China and Russia are supporting the Iranian regime. That makes sanctions much more difficult. And, of course, you have the black marketeers and the not nice fellows and the gangs who want to also get involved with this because they get cut-rate Iranian oil at a discount and then sell it at a premium. If you want to know what's going on in any of these countries, number one rule, follow the money. Once you follow the money, you find out who's getting it, and who's getting it, then you understand.
I know we're up against the clock. Ellen, I'll give you the last question for Dr. Sullivan.
Yeah, I was curious in general about where you see the oil market now, particularly in terms of the fundamentals of the oil market, and why, at least, what's your take in why we've seen fairly significant events over this past summer from a national security perspective. We've seen these events, particularly in the Middle East, and then they don't affect the oil market. What's your take on this? Or they don't affect the oil market as significantly as we would expect?
Well, obviously because of the United States being the largest producer of oil, and also there's a lot of oil in storage in China and elsewhere. The Chinese do this in a very smart way. They buy oil when it's low price, hence stabilizing the markets by not letting the oil prices drop too much, and then use those stored oil amounts when the price goes up, hence softening the market. China is the biggest importer of oil now. The United States is the biggest producer. The biggest exporter is Saudi Arabia. There were attempts to cut back through OPEC, and Ellen, you know this very well, through Saudi Arabia, in order to affect the prices to bring them back up to 80 or even 90 to help with the budget of Saudi Arabia and other countries. It didn't work because of the investment and production effect of higher oil prices in places that can produce it very quickly through shale gas and so forth. It doesn't take that long to reopen a shale oil field, and the new pipelines that are being developed in southwestern Texas going to Corpus Christi, new fields that are going to be developed throughout the United States. We have a massive amount of oil in the world. And also there's a sense of slowing down of the world economy because of the trade war, which I think is a completely bonkers policy. There is a debt overhang in the world that is keeping investment low and purchasing low. And a lot of people are worried about the world going into a recession. Oil demand does not increase when people are wondering whether they're actually going to use that oil or be able to sell that oil. Probably the worst thing for the Saudis to do right now is to get together with OPEC and cut production and put the price up. They put the price up and the world recession really starts to kick in. And in these circumstances, it would not only be just an increase in unemployment and a slowdown in GDP and trade, which is already happening, it would be stagflation. Because you have high oil prices, and you would also have higher prices coming out of China and other manufacturing countries because of tariffs. It's not a good combination, and I think we can turn this back. But there's a lot of discussion in Saudi Arabia and OPEC about reducing production, having cutbacks. This would be one of the worst times to do that, unless they want a recession and watch their demand evaporate in front of them.
Thanks to Dr. Sullivan for coming on. Had a little bit of technical difficulty there at the end, so we didn't get to sign him off properly, but we do appreciate him coming on and working through some of those background issues. Ellen, it's good to hear that it's not just me and you who are suspect of the Iranians going through Iraq, because there is a group of folks who seem to believe that, and I guess we're not alone in being questioning those realities.
Yeah, it seemed, I've long been skeptical of that, particularly since the amount of fuel it would take to drive oil over the mountains to Turkey. Or donkeys. Well, with the donkeys, you could just feed them alfalfa, right? Or are we talking about
it's just a lot of donkeys.
Donkeys on scooters, right? On motorized scooters. That's what they mean, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, so it's good to know that we're not alone in our skepticism of this. I did not know that Afghanistan has $4 trillion worth of minerals that it could exploit. That's a new one. I'm not surprised given how mountainous it is. I imagine that not sure all of those areas are quite as accessible as mining companies would appreciate.
Yeah. I knew they had a lot of poppies.
We all know they have a lot of poppies.
So that Nate, we'll tell Nate. Nate's listening, so Nate, be sure to link to the Dr. Sullivan's Twitter on the show notes so people can follow him and ask him questions about anything he might have said. We'll try to get him on again in the future. Ellen, it's that time of the show where we say, where will you be? You will obviously be on Twitter, setting the world straight. Where else will you be?
I will be on Bloomberg Radio. I did a segment earlier today, and I will put that link up when I get it. And I'm going to be on investing.com later this week. You should definitely check that out. I gave kind of a preview of the JMMC meeting that's happening on Thursday, but I'm going to do kind of a more in-depth dive into what it all means with this new Saudi oil minister. And I also have a piece coming out on Forbes looking at the whole nuclear fracas.
There we go. And I will be on the Texas Oil and Gas Podcast giving you my honest opinion of what I think of the Democrats' policy to ban fracking and the media who covers them. Obviously, Oil and Gas Contractors Connect. I think we have a new episode out this week. If not, I will definitely be on Bringing the Closers and on LinkedIn. I'm in there from time to time. Ellen, it's good to get another episode in the books. Hope you had a great Labor Day. Obviously, you survived Hurricane Dorian, even with the black marker gate.
Black marker gate, yeah. Hurricane Dorian was a little bit, I don't want to I'm glad we didn't have any issues, but I was I don't know. It did not come at us with all its fury.
Right. It was very bad for the people who got the brunt of it, but it wasn't as bad for us here on the mainland as we might have thought it was going to be. Because we were exchanging notes, whatever it was a week and a half ago, going, hey, everything okay. But glad to know that everything is okay for you guys. For the listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We will talk to you next week.